Hi everyone, welcome back to today's science lesson. Our topic is the nitrogen cycle as a repeated pattern in nature. Before we begin today's lesson, let's look at what we'll learn. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what nitrogen is and what we mean by the nitrogen cycle. Describe the 5 key stages of the nitrogen cycle. Explain the importance of the nitrogen cycle, and discuss why we must protect this natural cycle to keep our environment balanced. Let's start by talking about nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the most common gases in the air all around us. In fact, it makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, our bodies and every plant and animal need nitrogen to grow and stay healthy. But here's something surprising. Even though there's so much nitrogen in the air, we can't use it directly. Plants can't take it in from the air, and neither can we humans. Before nitrogen can help living things, it has to be changed into another form, one that plants can absorb through their roots. That process of changing and reusing nitrogen over and over again is what we call the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is the process that keeps nitrogen moving between the air, the soil, plants, and animals. As it moves, nitrogen keeps changing into different forms that living things can actually use. Think of it like a recycling system for Mother Nature. Nitrogen goes from the air into the soil, then into plants, from plants into animals and human beings, and later back into the air again. Here is an image showing how nitrogen moves around in nature. Let's take a closer look at it together. At the top, you notice the air or the atmosphere. That's where most of the nitrogen gas exists, about 78% of it. From the air, some nitrogen moves down into the soil. This happens through processes like lightning, or when certain bacteria in the soil take in nitrogen gas and change it into forms plants can use. Then look at the plants. They absorb the nitrogen from the soil through their roots. This helps them grow leaves, stems, and fruits. Now you'll also see animals in the image. Animals get nitrogen when they eat those plants, or when one animal eats another that has eaten plants. Finally, when plants and animals die, or when animals produce waste, the nitrogen goes back into the soil. Some of it is changed by bacteria into nitrogen gas again, which goes back up into the atmosphere. So if you follow the arrows in the image, you notice something important. The nitrogen keeps moving in a circle, from the air to the soil, to plants, to animals, and back to the air again. Now that we understand what the nitrogen cycle is, let's look at the 5 main stages that keep it going. Let's go through them one by one. Stage 1 is nitrogen fixation. This is when nitrogen gas from the air is changed into a form that plants can use, like ammonia or nitrates. Stage 2 is nitrification. Here, bacteria in the soil take that ammonia and change it into nitrates, which are even easier for plants to absorb. Stage 3 is assimilation. Plants absorb the nitrates from the soil through their roots and use them to make proteins and grow. Animals then get this nitrogen when they eat the plant. Stage 4 is ammonification. When plants and animals die, or when animals produce waste, decomposers like bacteria and fungi break it down, releasing ammonia back into the soil. Stage 5 is denitrification. This is when other bacteria change the nitrate back into nitrogen gas, sending it into the atmosphere again. Let's begin with stage 1, nitrogen fixation. This is where nitrogen gas from the atmosphere is changed into forms that plants and other living things can use. You see, nitrogen in the air, that's the gas called N2, is not usable by plants directly. It has to be converted into compounds like ammonia or nitrate before it becomes useful. This process is called nitrogen fixation. One good example of this is rhizobium bacteria. These bacteria live in the roots of legume plants such as beans, groundnuts, and peas. They take nitrogen gas from the air in the soil and change it into ammonia, which plants can absorb. Through nitrogen fixation, atmospheric nitrogen becomes part of the soil, ready for plants to use. It's the first step that makes all the others possible. There are 3 main ways nitrogen gas from the air can be changed into a usable form for plants. First, by bacteria. As mentioned earlier, certain bacteria in the soil, like rhizobium, live in the roots of plants such as beans and groundnuts. These bacteria take nitrogen gas from the air in the soil and convert it into ammonia. The plants then use this ammonia to make their food and grow. Second, by lightning. When lightning flashes in the sky, it has enough energy to break apart nitrogen gas molecules. The nitrogen then combines with oxygen and forms nitrates. When it rains, those nitrates mix with water and fall to the ground, adding nitrogen to the soil. And third, through human activity. Scientists and engineers have learned to do the same thing in factories. They use nitrogen gas from the air and change it into ammonia to make chemical fertilizers. Farmers then use those fertilizers to help their crops grow better. So, whether through bacteria, lightning, or human processes, nitrogen fixation is the first big step that allows nitrogen to enter the soil and support life. Now, let's move on to stage 2, litrification. This stage happens inside the soil and is carried out by very tiny living things called bacteria. It's a 2-step process that changes ammonia into nitrates, which plants can absorb easily. In the first step, one group of bacteria changes ammonia, that's NH3, into a new substance called nitrites, written as NO2-. In the second step, another group of bacteria changes those nitrites into nitrates, written as NO3-. These nitrates are very important because most plants can only take in nitrogen when it's in this nitrate form. It's different from the first stage, nitrogen fixation, which makes ammonia from nitrogen gas in the air. Nitrification happens after that. It prepares the nitrogen in the soil so plants can absorb it. So, thanks to these bacteria again, the nitrogen that entered the soil in stage 1 becomes ready food for plants in stage 2. Let's move on to stage 3, assimilation. Assimilation is the process where plants absorb nitrates from the soil through their roots and use them to make food and grow. Those nitrates came from the previous stage, nitrification, and now the plants are ready to take them in. inside the plant, those nitrates are used to build proteins and other important compounds that help the plant grow strong and healthy. For example, a maize plant absorbs nitrates from the soil to grow its leaves, stem, and cob. But the nitrogen doesn't stop there. When animals eat the plant, they also take in the nitrogen. So when a goat eats the maize plant, it gets the nitrogen that was stored inside the plant. Then we humans eat either the plant or the animal, and the nitrogen passes on again. If someone eats maize directly or eats the goat, they also get nitrogen. So you see, through assimilation, nitrogen moves up the food chain, from soil to plants to animals and to humans. That's how it becomes part of every living thing. Now let's look at stage 4, ammonification. This stage happens when plants and animals die, or when animals produce waste like manure. Tiny organisms in the soil called decomposers, mainly bacteria and fungi, start to do their work. These decomposers break down the dead plants, dead animals, and waste materials. As they do this, they release ammonia back into the soil. For example, when a leaf falls to the ground and rots, or when animal feces break down, the decomposers convert that material into ammonia. This ammonia then becomes food again for the bacteria that carry out nitrification. So, ammonification is like nature's way of recycling nitrogen from dead matter back into the soil, keeping the cycle going. Let's take a closer look at how ammonification happens. This process takes place in 3 main steps. Step 1. Death and decay. Plants and animals eventually die, or animals produce waste such as manure. These materials contain nitrogen locked inside them. Step 2. Decomposers get to work. Tiny organisms like bacteria and fungi feed on the dead plants, dead animals, and waste. As they break them down, they start changing the nitrogen compounds inside those materials. Step 3. Ammonia is released. The decomposers convert that nitrogen into ammonia, which goes back into the soil. That ammonia can then be used again by other bacteria in the next stage of the nitrogen cycle. So through ammonification, nitrogen that was once inside living things returns to the soil, ready to support new life again. Is that not interesting? We've reached the final stage of the nitrogen cycle, denitrification. Denitrification is the process where bacteria in the soil convert nitrates back into nitrogen gas. This nitrogen gas then escapes into the atmosphere, completing the cycle. This process mostly happens in places where the soil is waterlogged or has very little oxygen. For example, wetlands, flooded fields, or compacted soils are perfect places for denitrifying bacteria to live. Once this gas is back in the atmosphere, the cycle starts all over again with nitrogen fixation. And that's how the entire nitrogen cycle connects, from air to soil to plants to animals and back to the air once more. Now that we've seen all 5 stages of the nitrogen cycle, let's talk about why this cycle is so important. The nitrogen cycle keeps nature in balance and makes sure all living things get the nitrogen they need to survive. Let's look at a few key reasons why it matters. First, it provides essential nutrients. The cycle supplies plants with usable nitrogen, which they use to make proteins and grow. Without this, plants would be weak and crops wouldn't develop properly. Second, it supports all life. Animals and humans get nitrogen by eating plants or other animals that have already taken in nitrogen. So the nitrogen cycle keeps the food chain alive and healthy. Third, it maintains balance in nature. The nitrogen cycle constantly recycles nitrogen between the air, the soil, plants, and animals, ensuring nothing is wasted. And fourth, it sustains agriculture. The cycle helps farmers grow healthy crops, either through natural soil processes or with the help of fertilizers. Good nitrogen balance means better harvests and more food for everyone. In essence, the nitrogen cycle is a lifeline for plants, animals, and humans alike. Now let's talk about something very important: why we must protect the nitrogen cycle. This natural cycle keeps life on Earth in balance, but some of the things humans do can disturb that balance and cause serious problems. For example, using too much fertilizer on farms adds more nitrogen to the soil than plants can use. The extra nitrogen washes into rivers and lakes, leading to water pollution and harming fish and other animals. Another issue is cutting down forests. When trees are removed, the soil loses nutrients and bacteria that help with nitrogen fixation. This makes it harder for plants to get the nitrogen they need. Even industrial activities that release harmful gases into the air can upset the natural nitrogen balance. That's why it's so important to protect this cycle. Without it, plants would not grow properly, animals would lack food, and life as we know it would not exist. So we all have a role to play by using fertilizers wisely, keeping our water clean, and taking care of our environment. Protecting the nitrogen cycle means protecting life itself. Before we end our lesson, let's take a moment to think. Imagine what would happen if the nitrogen cycle suddenly stopped working. If nitrogen could no longer move between the air, the soil, plants, and animals, what would life be like? Plants would stop growing because they wouldn't get the nitrogen they need. Animals that depend on those plants for food would also struggle to survive. And eventually, humans would face food shortages and serious environmental problems. Think about how amazing it is that nature has designed a system that never stops working, quietly keeping life going all around us. And that brings us to the end of our lesson on the nitrogen cycle as a repeated pattern in nature. We learned how nitrogen travels through the air, the soil, plants, and animals, and how this endless cycle keeps life on Earth balanced. So next time you see plants growing or rain falling, think about how the nitrogen cycle is quietly working behind the scenes to make it all possible. See you in the next lesson.